Thank you so much for joining us, the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Mitch Troutman, who's a writer, educator, organizer, and jack of all trades living in central Pennsylvania. He is a direct descendant of bootleg coal miners and belongs to the group Anthracite Unite. And his latest book, Bootleg Coal Rebellion, The Pennsylvania Miners Who Seized an Industry, is out now via PM Press. Mitch, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good morning or good afternoon.
And good night, depending on when people are listening to this. So as a writer and as a creative, I hate when people ask questions like, so why a book? Or so what's it about? Those are ridiculous and far too broad questions. So instead, to give people kind of a little teaser to whet people's appetite to go and read your book, I wanted to ask you to pick out one of your favorite stories from the book, because what I really appreciate about the book is that you don't tell it from this kind of up above looking down perspective. You use words from those who were there and lived through it themselves, and then you kind of extrapolate outwards. And so I'd like you to just share a story from the book that gives people kind of a cool idea of what the book is about, and will make everyone want to rush and go read it.
Sure. I'll just kind of pick one off the top of my head. There was this place called Jackson's Patch outside the town of Mackinac City. And so many of the mines had closed down that there were a lot of unemployed people in town. Many of them were bootlegging coal, right? We're not stealing, like digging their own coal holes on company land. So like it was stealing technically, but they didn't always consider it stealing. In any case, they were doing that at night and kind of keeping it a secret. And then the company announced it was going to open a big strip mine and just destroy this town of Jackson's Patch, which was, maybe a dozen or two houses. And there was this group that formed called the Farmers and Laborers Unemployed Organization, which was like socialist led. But they got the unemployed miners together with the remaining employed miners, and also the textile factories, which were mostly women. And they organized this blockade for several months of this town to stop it from being strip mined. They set up like 4 different camps with goofy names. I remember one of them is called like Camp Stinky, along the routes that they could take a strip mine shovel to get in there and destroy the town. It wasn't over an environmental issue. It was over employment because strip mining, gets a lot more coal for a lot less workers. And also the people in the town itself didn't want their town destroyed. It didn't last forever. And eventually there was like a negotiated settlement, basically, that they did end up strip mining it, but the people who lived there would be paid to be relocated, things like that. But that is a story that I came across while researching this that is never heard of it before, haven't found anybody alive who even knows the name of that town because it ceased to exist then, but it shows off a lot of their militancy, and like the strength of solidarity is this theme throughout the book, where they just pull off these different things, often with unemployed and employed working together, that are stories I've not only never heard in history, but like I don't hear now either. Right. And so inspiring to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, just hearing you say that, that people don't know about the story because that town ceased to exist, it really speaks to how history is literally and figuratively bulldozed every day. And if no one's there to collect these stories, then they will be buried. And I do want to circle back to that in a bit, but first I want to start with something that is like very much the Project Censored angle, because so much of what we do here is cover what corporate media doesn't cover and won't cover. And I think one of the things that was so striking in your book is that you actually start in the introduction with the story of a reporter going to coal country in Pennsylvania to get the story of the bootleggers. And you write in the introduction, quote, "As is the method of any good reporter, he didn't rely on company press releases, but went straight to the people of the region, seeking to experience what they described and understand it from their perspective," end quote. And when I read that, I was like, well, I have to be honest, I chuckled because I was like, yeah, that is what a reporter would do, but what none of them do today. And so I wanted to get your take about how the story of media in that moment in the beginning of the 1900s played a role in terms of the Bootleg Coal Rebellion, and how they used it, and how reporters actually might have done a good job of journalism back then.
Yeah, oh my God, there is like so much to be said on that, and I definitely can't get to it all, which is, why I wrote a book. But yeah, that guy was Louis Ademic, I believe is how you say his name. And he was a reporter who was he was like a leader of like the pluralists, which is basically multiculturalism. He was an Eastern European immigrant, and he really wanted to know how other immigrants in the country were living at the time. And so that was kind of his focus. But yeah, the media landscape's totally different back then. And I can't say I investigated enough to know who owns what outlets or anything like that, but it's certainly not corporate conglomerates, right? And there's a lot less worry about brands and things like that, and probably a lot more focus on the individual editors and owners and what their interests are. But newspaper editors actually play a huge role in the story. I want to say in the book, but it's actually, they played a huge role in history, right? In Shamokin, one of like the key bootleg towns, the head newspaper man, the editor there, Joseph Agar, he would negotiate between the companies and the bootleg miners and sort of act as a neutral zone, an intermediary. But he also went to basically every bootleggers meeting. The bootleggers formed unions and had public large meetings. But he would write under a pen name a lot of the time. For what reason, I'm not sure, but it's still really cool to see somebody playing that whole role there. And then there was another newspaper editor who sort of led this other thing called the equalization movement, which is a long story in and of itself. But I believe he owned his own newspaper in this small town. And when push came to shove, he fully sided with the people there rather than the company in town, the big newspapers at the time, when they covered the bootleg miners, so like Philly and New York, they often trashed them, were super disparaging. And that's because those were the centers of capital that owned the coal companies, right? Mostly JP Morgan and Wall Street, but also the Drexel Trusts in Philly. But then the national news had just a fascination with the bootleg miners, and a lot of their coverage, be it in magazines like or in film, right? They were like very sympathetic to the bootleg miners, partly because it's a fascinating story, but also because there was like a widespread dissatisfaction, you could say, with the coal companies, because this coal specifically is used to heat homes. And so there had been a lot of strikes, and the public was largely blaming the coal companies at this time for it, and I think that left a lot of space open for people to go do, that kind of journalism where they would just go drive until they found a bootleg miner alongside the road and interview them, and definitely gave a lot of insight into it. But it was also, I don't know, you don't see as much like it, even where there's outlets that still send reporters to do work like that, they're few and far between. Even a lot of like foreign wars and things like that are barely receiving like direct coverage from reporters.
Well, yeah, and of course, the a friend of mine who's an Army veteran, she was scooped up by the Army because they found out that she wanted to do journalism, and so they called her home, which I don't know how this is legal, but as part of the economic draft, and said, "Hey, do you want to be a journalist in the Army?" And she thought that that would mean that she would be like on the front lines writing about what's going on. But no, she was basically a liaison for corporate media, and her job was to show them only the pretty stuff and to only show them the things that were sanctioned by the Army. And so, I mean, like when CNN goes to Baghdad or to, wherever, it's not like they're going into the fray without the Army knowing exactly what's going on. The Army wants to frame this perfectly. So even when you do have quote unquote war reporters these days, the ones that are for corporate media are very specifically shown, hey, this is where you're pointing the camera.
A funny thing about this story too is this all happens in the 1930s, or mostly happens then. And the anthracite coal industry is sort of the last like big industry in America to not get into marketing, right? Because marketing's only coming around after World War I, when they're like, hey, this war propaganda stuff, maybe we can use that to make money. And the anthracite companies still believe that like the thing they produce is so essential to the economy that who cares, what anybody else thinks about it. And so it's kind of a strange milestone in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, speaking of war, how things shift when the Second World War comes about as well. But I'm curious in terms of the media, how much did you lean on that or pull from that in order to write this book? And what kind of media sources? I know you mentioned like, smaller papers and things like that, but can you dig into a little bit more of that and talk about like what media you were able to pull from?
Yeah, as far as sources, like I definitely started with the interviews with the people who had been alive in that time and wanted to wrap it around those. But from there, I had like about 3,000 newspaper and magazine articles that I found. It's a wonderful thing to be a researcher in the age of searching on a computer. And that was a lot to sort through. The vast majority of it are local newspaper accounts, and you really can't take those. They're often very short and confusing details, right? So you have to read a bunch in succession, and hopefully another paper covered the same thing, things like that, to try to wrap your head around events. But the national magazines and things like that, they had a lot more colorful coverage, a lot more quotes and interviews, things like that. And like I said, there was this film in 1935. There was this newsreel company, right? Movie theaters are actually an industry that did great during the Great Depression because people were eager to spend $1 to stop thinking about their life for a minute. And so the newsreel became really big, where you go to the theater, pay some money, and watch the news. And it was very, very dramatic and kind of epic. And so there's this great 6-minute film about the bootleg miners that's very sympathetic. They even had the bootleg miners reenact a fight with the cops. But yeah, between the local and national media, again, also dealing with that many different sources, it was helpful to like kind of categorize it and see what happens over time, what different things are changing. And the bootleggers also get into a lot of fights because there's bootleg truckers who are taking the coal from these coal holes and selling it from Connecticut on down to Maryland or wherever. And eventually, when the companies are losing on the home front, where the bootleg miners basically have immunity after a while, just because there's so many of them and they're organizing. The companies start going after the truckers in the locations where they're selling the coal, arresting them, trying to pass various laws, because the thing with coal in a truck is it doesn't have a made in what county sticker on it. It's just coal. So the bootleg unions started hiring lawyers to go to all these different places and fight battles on behalf of the bootleg truckers. And so the media in those areas, there's like a whole saga of this that goes on in Baltimore that's somewhat removed from the main story. A whole other one in New York. And I don't know. The more you dig, there was just a lot of press coverage during that time, which is amazing that this story has been so forgotten, because it was people were well aware of it at the time.
Yeah, that's another good point, is the kind of I feel like we're goldfish these days, even, remembering something from 2001, much less something from like 1935. But I'm also curious, because something that you talk about in the book is about the role of communism and socialism, and how ideologies did not steer the bootleg coal movement, but how they played parts here and there, and also how the Red Scare played a role in basically trying to break up and trying to blackball a lot of people, not just in the coal regions, but all over the country. I'm curious if you saw anything in media as well once that started happening, like a shift that went from like, oh, look at these bootleg coal miners and they're, your typical American, to like, they're commies, everybody run away.
Yeah, I didn't see a whole lot of labeling all of them as commies. I mean, there was a whole lot of labeling them all as criminals, again, especially from like Philly and New York and things like that. But there was kind of a shift around 1940 that I was seeing in the articles, but without context, it took me a while to figure out what was going on, right? And around 1940 or whatever, there's a faction of the bootleg miners that turns anti-communist and starts trying to kick the communists out of the bootleg unions. And you know, my brain, I understand that there's a Red Scare after this, and I understand that there's a Red Scare before this, but trying to figure out the ins and outs of why it was popular in that time, which, to be honest, I don't remember off the top of my head right now. But yeah, no, there wasn't too much of that. But then after, you know, after the war, people are quick to say they're not communists, you know, as the McCarthy era comes on. And then I believe that that's a big part of why this history was forgotten, because people didn't want to be associated with radicalism in the 50s. And even in the late 80s, early 90s, when the interviews for this book were being done by somebody else, people were still uncomfortable saying who was a communist or not. You know, there was this one I really liked, this one interview where the guy's like, well, sure, he would stand up on a box and he would talk about communism, but whether that makes him a communist, I really can't say, you know. And it's funny, you know, it's like that person in particular was deported as part of the Red Scare. You know, he went before the House of American Activities Committee and all that. But yeah, but not a big attempt to paint the bootleg miners with a broad brush. And actually, I did find a lot of articles trying to argue that the bootleg miners were rejecting communism, right? But which is more or less true. Like, the communists were not large in number among the bootleg miners, but it was a strange Americanism, you know, trying to say, oh no, these are good. Like, there's two camps and they're mostly good and patriotic and you know. And that's from anti-communist writers themselves, who have a bigger axe to grind, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating how that Red Scare just created such a shadow over the rest of people's lives. I mean, to have people talking about this in the 90s and still being like, but, you know, not communist or anything. I mean, that's remarkable. That really speaks to how powerful that propaganda campaign was.
What's amazing is during this time period, though, they really communism and socialism, they weren't winning elections, you know, they weren't swaying whole towns or anything like that, but they were common enough that people basically saw it as, oh yeah, you have the Democrats, the Republicans, and the communists. That's just who's around, you know.
Yeah, I think that's another good point. Like, there was a communist party in the US, and it was not a scary thing until it was the scariest thing. And yeah, and I think that I also wanted to take that thread and kind of talk about, because in the book you do a really good job of highlighting how they became radicalized, not through an ideology, not because everybody sat down and read Marx or something, but because they needed to fight to survive, and this just seemed like the most logical path to take. And people can call it radical, they can call it communist, they can call it anarchist. People outside of it ended up putting labels on it, and I guess still do. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and how, like, the labeling attempt can oftentimes do worse things for a movement than just allowing it to kind of organically become what it's going to be.
Yeah. Let me think for a second. You get to edit out silence, right? Sorry. Yeah, so when you have, I don't know, a town, right, of 5 or 10,000 people, they think all sorts of stuff. And when you have them all engaging in an illegal activity together and organizing around it, that means you have everyone across the board, not only people of like contradicting political ideas, but also the majority of people who just have ideas that are all over the place, right? Different loyalties, different things they like to stay away from, people who like to keep their head low, all of that. So at very first, bootlegging was something they were doing at night, and it was pure survival. and they were dodging the cops, trying to hide from the cops, right? But eventually people started standing up to the cops. A little bit of it was the more radical among them, like bringing that fight, but it was also just the pure desperation. At the end of the day, for some people, it was like, if you destroy my bootleg hole, you might as well kill me. So uh, I'm not coming out. You're going to have to kill me to do this. And that inspired other people to be more bold and brought them all eventually to working in the middle of the broad daylight in these towns. If you wanted bootleg coal, you could drive over and just go to the main street. There'd be 6, 7 bootleg coal vendors right there. Um, and then the radicals among them had been calling from the beginning for there to be some kind of bootleggers unions. But when they actually formed, it was always around like specific things that bootleggers in different towns were dealing with, whether it was they had to somehow negotiate with a company or resist something, a legal threat, something like that. And then they formed unions and cohered like that. And there was also the dynamiting of excuse me. There was also the dynamiting of strip mine shovels and large attacks on the police, or fights with the police. And as they heard about those, perhaps you were in a really rural place in a town of 1,000, right? But you heard that people in this town and people in that other town were up to that. That really made them feel quite powerful. There were several things that happened in the state government, particularly where the state decided that the state police would not interfere. And that also felt like a green flag to people. It felt like a go ahead. And as they built power and they saw their own numbers and they felt that their whole community was behind them, they certainly got more and more radical over time. But they would also not, they didn't want that title, you know? Sure, there might be some violence, sure, they went to extreme ends and totally disregarded property rights for the coal companies. But they would still say, "Oh, the radicals, they're over in some other town, not our town." You know. As for how it can be dangerous, I don't know. I mean, I could have written this book from an anarchist perspective and seen it as like prefigurative, seen it as something that was the very beginning of something much longer. But that's not how they thought, right? And so I didn't want to frame it that way. And certainly, I used the word seize in the subtitle because you could also look at it from a Marxist point of view. They are seizing the means of production, but that wasn't a phrase that the vast majority of them were using, nor exactly how they were thinking. Their long-term goal was to force the coal companies to reopen and employ them safely and at better wages. But the longer it went on, the longer they were bootleggers, the more they set up their own infrastructure and pushed themselves to act on their own and drifted farther and farther away from feeling a need to be linked to the coal companies.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that you bring up, is that I think historically we can't help but look at history through the lens of the present, because we don't know what it's like to be alive at any other time than ours. And so it's hard, I think, to look to the past and not be like, oh, that's so this and that's so that, and use like labels that the people themselves would never have used to describe themselves. And so I think it's a real statement, and I think it's a very powerful point that you make by not twisting it to be, oh, this is so anarchist or this is so that, because it does a much better service to the people in that time. And I think that that's why it's so great that you use those stories of the people themselves as opposed to from that like top-down perspective.
Yeah, and certainly people from different ideologies can look at this and see things that are important to their arguments and their way of thinking, right? I just wanted to recreate the feeling of what it was for people to go through this in the first place and how they arrived at those points, not just merely that it happened that way.
And I think that kind of shifts us to my next question, which I think, for me personally, I'm a history nerd, so I just always love reading about history. But there's the question of like, why write this now? Why do you feel that, when you started digging into these stories, why did you say, oh, well, this needs to be shared? What made you feel like it was important to share these stories, if now was now in particular or just in general?
some of my focus was certainly local, and telling local people their own history, that it was more radical than they thought, and to show them that that our ancestors did illegal things to survive, and perhaps that leads to building some solidarity between other people who do illegal things to survive. But as I was researching it, we kept going through all different political moments, and different pieces of the book would strike me at different times in those political moments as seeming relevant. Um, right now, yeah, pause because I don't know what to say there. What I think is refreshing about like this particular history is the audacity of the tactics they used, and there's just several different movements going on, doing several different things that I haven't heard of before. And so, while there's probably not another industry that this could be done with currently, just straight up seizing it and selling it and all that. I think it's refreshing how creative it feels, and it's especially inspiring to me. Again, that level of like solidarity that people have to be able to pull these things off. It's hard to imagine because solidarity sometimes feels like such a stretch if you're not involved in a union or workplace organizing campaign, or organizing a group of people in a community. Even then it can be hard to imagine what like real strong widespread solidarity could do and could feel like. And there's some great examples in this history.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that made me think about, that I thought about when I was reading it, was something that somebody in West Virginia actually told me, which was where they were talking about the mine wars, and they were saying when the fear of change is less than the fear of things staying the same, that's when people act. And that always stuck with me because I think that applies to today. That applies to every time period. The French Revolution, like, and pick a time when people were like, actually, you know what? No, you can't do this anymore, and we're pushing back. There's that underlying message there, and I think that you really do a good job of highlighting that in the book, because this was not something that somebody did just because they were bored. This was an act of desperation. And I think we can, even though the mirror is a bit distorted in terms of time, we can see ourselves in that same image, I think.
Yeah, there's lots of quotes in here that capture it better than I could in my own words. So this one is from a guy named Kraus, who's a bootleg miner. They said they closed the mines because it was uneconomic, but I got a wife and 4 kids. I always took good care of them. Now, when they get the hunger and the kids' shoes wear out, what do I tell them? That this here coal is uneconomic? Like hell I do. I go out and dig coal. And I think that captures pretty well what you're saying. That was the attitude. Are we just supposed to starve? You just want us to lay down and die so that everything's in good order, right? No, we have to do something. And they tried other things. It wasn't only bootlegging that they tried, but other things didn't work out. Charity couldn't cut it. There was too much deprivation. The union couldn't cut it. They could do a little, but they couldn't do enough, right? And so when all other methods are exhausted, that's when they start bootlegging out in the open.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good quote. I don't think the kid cares if it's uneconomic, if the kid's hungry. And I think, like, kind of wrapping up here, I think again, I'm a history nerd, so for me, I feel like I know, I personally have an answer to this question, but I'm curious what you feel too, is the concept of using, and you've touched upon this a little bit, but the concept of using the history of a place as an organizing tool, and the importance of perhaps doing that across the board. So, like I remember organizing in DC. One of the things that we would do is at meetings of mutual aid meetings, we'd oftentimes share a bit of history, like, oh, there was this radical organizing during the AIDS epidemic where they created a space for people to go and get healthcare and get support. And so I think, like, how do you feel about using history as an organizing tool, and how have you personally experienced that now that you have the book out?
Yeah, so I come from the Pennsylvania Dutch, and there's a whole attitude of nothing interesting has ever happened here, ever, right? Life is slow, life is boring. If you want interesting things, watch TV, you know? And again, growing up, I had never heard of this stuff. And when I found it, it's like, oh, come on, you people did this, you know? Um, and I think the best the in when history is taught best, it's taught to give us agency in the present, right? To show that nothing was ever inevitable and nothing was ever just because one person did a big thing. You know, one person can do a big thing, and if there's not other things going on around them, nothing happens. History happens because people make it happen, and today is tomorrow's history. And this this is powerful because it shows so much agency, and because it tells a whole area where, an interesting thing about the anthracite coal region is we have a diaspora. We have a lot of people who grew up here and then moved away, or maybe they never even lived in the anthracite, but they know that's where their family came, and they pay attention to it. And it's a core part of like how they see themselves and their family. And the part of like Americanism is like whitewashing history, right? Making it look all clean cut. Like the majority of people were just business as usual, doing good things. Yeah, they did the American Revolution. That was right. Then they went back to business as usual. And it's just not true. It's just not true. So many times business interests and profit have cut against people. So many times people have had to do something about it. And so the generic story of the Great Depression, we tighten, we put, or sorry. And the generic story of the Depression is, yeah, times were tough. We ate some like weird food. We grew some vegetables and had some chickens, and we just kind of sat around and looked sad until the war came, right? I mean, I say it like that to make fun of it, but when you just fill in the blanks with that, that's how you get all these like weird political arguments today that rely on some nostalgia for stuff that just didn't happen that way. And a lot of, most of the people in this book or in this history are immigrants, and second or third generation immigrants. And a lot of ethnic groups in the United States today came through this region. A lot of people who were miners in other places were miners in this region first. And so this history is a lot of people's history. And it's also how the whole East Coast kept their houses warm through the winters of the Great Depression. This ties into a lot of people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it also reminds me of some I think it was Bill Bryson who in one of his books said, if anybody ever, if you're of European descent and anyone ever says to you, I'm related to William the Conqueror, you just say me too, because if you go that far back, you're just related to him, and that's it. And obviously it's not as far back as William the Conqueror, but it does speak to how, something that can seem very localized has such large ripples when you consider the people that were part of it in an auxiliary way, or where that coal ended up, or where the people then ended up and their kids, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's also a really important point to highlight.
Yeah, by some people's attitudes today, you would think JP Morgan had like 70 million grandchildren. People need to know where they came from.
That's disturbing to think about. But but so Mitch, thank you so much for taking the time, and tell people where they can find out more about the book and about you.
More about the book, bootlegcoal.com, PM Press, my publisher, but you can find it, wherever you're going to find books. Hey, if you want to check it out and don't feel like spending the money, ask your library to order it. More about me. I don't have a big public persona. Just check out the book.
You're the man of mystery behind the book. Well, cool. Thank you so much, Mitch. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.